Hello everyone, and welcome to the second lecture on True Dhamma. If you have not watched the first lecture, I would invite you to check the description of the video or one of the playlists that is somewhere linked on the channel, and maybe watch the first lecture first, where I present all the stuff that is necessary to understand this lecture properly. So all the contents and an outline of the lecture is presented there in about 50 minutes of length. It's not the longest lecture. But today is the first real content lecture where I try to show all the similarities and all the points where Buddhism and science are in line. Again, my name is Dr. Florian Lau from the Self-Improvement Hub, and today we will dive into the following. First of all, we will focus a bit on meditation studies, which are a rather interesting topic. I have some criticism when it comes to all the, let's call it, studies on meditation, because studies are kind of an empirical science, so you have to take them with a grain of salt. They are mainly a snapshot of our time as it is right now. So whenever we question certain people with questionnaires, we will always snapshot how things are right now. That does not mean that they are really like that, for example, in the future. So there has to be some grain of salt involved. Then the next big section will be on karma, or Kamma, as it's called by the Buddha's dialect, choice or action. The next part will be on the nature of all things, because the Dhamma, as the Buddha called his teachings, is the nature of all things. Dhamma with a small d means thing, and with a big D it means nature of things, in a sense, or that which things stand on. Then we will dive into a bit of content on the science of the observer and non-self, and talk a bit about the limitations of science. Then there will be a small summary, and in the end there will be some literature when it comes to meditation studies. This will be the only section where I will focus on such studies. In the remaining chapters of the book there will be just references to all the suttas, the lectures of the Buddha. And now let us just begin. And this is the first time I do that. In the beginning, there will be 5 minutes of mindfulness. I will not sit here for 5 minutes, but I would invite you to do 5 minutes of, for example, observing your breath, where you try to do literally nothing, where you try to resist your emotional impulses and just sit there, maybe in the lotus posture. You don't have to sit on the floor or on a meditation cushion. A chair is perfectly fine. And you can pause the video here if you wish. It's obviously completely optional, but the best effect is obviously if you do it as intended. So if you wish to, feel free to pause this video for 5 minutes here and do 5 minutes of mindfulness meditation or non-reactivity. It's very beneficial, and it's a very good idea to try it, to see the results for yourself. Okay, I will assume that many of you will have finished the 5 minutes of non-reactivity by now, and now we can continue with the content of this presentation. And I like to start with the initial doubt when it comes to everything related to meditation or Buddhism or religion in general, because that topic is something that is has a certain barrier of entrance for most people. And what allowed me to engage with Buddhism as a scientist is the following. There are certain facts about Buddhism that are rather interesting, that allow for an easy entrance point for someone that does not come from a religious or spiritual background. For those people, it's no big deal to get into Buddhism, but for everyone else, it might be rather difficult. And the first thing that comes to mind is that there is no evangelizing in Buddhism, but it is still a rather successful religion. So Buddhists typically do not go out and convert people. They just wait till people come to them. So there's no real advertisement going on. While there are teachings available, certainly, everywhere indeed, there is a rather large body of Dhamma talks, for example, available on YouTube, and content on meditation. While not all of that is good, all right, there is still a lot of content available that is good, but you have to dig through it and look for contradictions to find it. And then again, the next topic is that helped me understand and accept that it might be something beneficial and worthwhile to do, that there are no false beliefs. There is no faith that is strictly necessary, and skepticism is allowed and even encouraged in Buddhism. So there is no such thing that you cannot question. You can, but you should question it skillfully, let's put it like that. The Buddha gave us a list of experiments that allowed for testing the things that he said. He always gave us a path, a training or some sort of experiment that we can do to test all the statements that he made. If we follow them and conduce to them rightly, then we will see that the results that the Buddha was talking about will manifest. And then we have the confirmed kind of faith. So the faith that is necessary in Buddhism is more akin to a delay of disbelief. That is not too different from watching a movie. You believe that the movie could be good. If you were convinced that it is bad, then you would not watch it. Or for a book, if you were convinced that it is a bad book, then you would not read it. So you delay your disbelief up to the point of testing, which is a very logical thing to do. And that is very much encouraged in Buddhism. And the next thing that comes to mind is that Buddhism, at least when it comes to the Pali Canon, which is not very mythical, whenever there occur gods, for example, they are not really related to the teaching. The Buddha just used them to show that the gods too are subject to all the ailments and the problems that he is trying to solve with his teachings. So it is extremely logical, it is extremely internally consistent and free from contradictions and need of interpretation. I don't want to bash other traditions or anything like that, or other religions, but most of the time books like the Bible require interpretation. And there's a lot of texts, passages that contradict with each other. That does not happen in the Pali Canon. The Buddha was always incredibly consistent with everything that he was saying. So when he says that violence is bad, then there are literally no cases in the entire, 10 to 20,000 pages of very tiny font books of the initial Pali Canon that can be trusted, that I also presented in the last lecture, that contains anything that goes against it. Nothing. And the same is true for all the other key points of his teachings. They do not really require an interpretation. You still have to understand what is in there, so sometimes it's not too obvious, as those things require some insight. But after all, there is at least no internal contradiction. And when the body of text is that big, that's a rather big deal. And the next thing that comes to mind is that the Dhamma, the teachings of the Buddha, is visible here and now, and not after death. Most of the time when you follow another religion, you have to wait until you die to see if you made it to heaven or to the afterlife of your desire. In Buddhism, that is not necessary. Whatever he praised and taught, you can test it here and now. The Nibbana or Nirvana that the Buddha was talking about, those are the same thing by the way, just from different languages, is visible here and now. It is always there, and you could realize it on the basis of the proper training. And the next thing that helped me a little bit, at least initially, while it might not be technically correct, is that Buddhism is more of a philosophy than a religion. In reality, any salvation philosophy could also be called a religion, and Buddhism is very much a salvation philosophy from all suffering. Well, at least initially it helped me to think about it in terms of philosophy rather than religion. And the Buddha really invites us to see for ourselves. And another very important thing, at least for me, is, at least to distinguish Buddhism from a cult, that there is no money in the entire business for the monks. They are not allowed to own anything. So there's no real benefit except food. And everyone can have food nowadays. And they don't even get good food. It's more like, in Germany it's called Brockenspeise. They just eat what they get. It's donated to them on alms around every day. So there really is no material gain in it for the monks. And yeah, that's a very good sign that it's not a cult. Because in many other traditions or in cults, there are lots of rules that prohibit questioning certain things, and there's always gains to be made by the leaders of the cult. You have to renounce your wealth or anything like that. None of that is necessary in Buddhism. It's extremely down to earth, it's extremely logical. And there are a lot of studies proving the benefits of meditation. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of studies, but they can help with the initial doubt. So if you have some big doubt about the effects of meditation, then I would invite you to check out some meditation studies. Maybe some of those studies that will be linked at the end of the talk, or that we are talking about very soon. And this section will indeed talk about meditation studies, as that might be the most popular entry point to the entire topic nowadays. And I have prepared some advantages when it comes to the simple practice of mindfulness of breathing, and I will only really annoy you with study references in this slide and maybe one or two other slides. Apart from that, I don't really want to fling studies at you, because most of the time they are hidden behind a paywall, and I don't really want to encourage that kind of behavior. I'm a scientist myself, and I kind of hate it when I have to buy all the studies, or when my university has not paid for certain online libraries, and I have to write all the authors on ResearchGate or whatever to get a draft of their paper. But anyway, let us begin. So some of the advantages of very simple kinds of meditation that you can, for example, do with a certain app to get into it are increased concentration. So your ability to remain with your mind on one topic, like when you try to do your homework assignments for university or school, or focus on one task at work, is greatly increased. Concentration, in a sense, could also be called indistractability of the mind. And when your mind is indistractable and you are not pulled around or pushed around by your emotions all the time, then it's much easier to learn and focus on one task at hand. The next thing is that our memory capacity due to meditation is greatly increased usually, because all the distracting topics are not affecting our mind as much as before. So we have much more mental capacities that we can direct towards the task of remembering, and thus our mind is not clouded all the time with immediate desires, and thus we can remember things much better. The next thing is that it reduces addiction and increases discipline. And this is also rather simple to see. You wouldn't strictly need studies to prove all of this, but it's nice to have them for very beginners who are very skeptical at first. And no one can really blame them, because some religions and some cults really have created a rather negative image for other religions and other practices that might be strictly beneficial. So the addiction part and the increased discipline part can easily be explained by the fact that meditation is basically an exercise in enduring negative feelings in the beginning. It will be very uncomfortable to even sit for 5 minutes. Your mind will immediately jump out and want to watch series or YouTube videos or listen to music or enjoy tasty foods. But in a sense, you deny your mind its wishes for a time. And in doing so, you become better at denying your mind wishes and urges and do not give in. And this is pretty much the definition of discipline, that you are able to do one thing that you committed to and don't let yourself be distracted all the time. The next thing that studies have proven is that meditation slows down the mental and bodily aging processes. And the simple explanation for that would be that you are not as susceptible to stress as you were before. Stress might be the one thing that causes the greatest trend and acceleration of biological aging. It's not a meme that some people who went through great deals of stress turn gray very fast and get wrinkly faces, as an example. And if you simply go by studies on longevity, for example, the gated, or let's not call them gated communities, or I'm not sure how they call blue communities or something like that, I always forget the name, tend to be full of people like monks. They eat little, are content with little, they meditate a lot, and as a result, they live very long lives. So if you want to emulate their lifestyles, then you can be quite sure that it will have a positive influence on your longevity. The negative aspect of all of this might be that you can't really follow your instant gratification urges anymore. But if that's worth it for you, and it can be, because they don't do that kind of lifestyle because they suffer through it, they do it because it is very, very pleasant. But it takes some ramp-up time. But anyway, let us continue. The next thing that meditation positively affects is that it decreases stress overall and strengthens your immune system. Those two things are very much interconnected because health is very much affected by stress. When you are under the effect of stress, there will be stress hormones in the bloodstream, namely cortisol as an example, or sometimes even adrenaline or other substances that are very much related to stress that require immediate action of the body. And when you are stressed, and there is a lot of cortisol in the blood, then the entire nutrient storage and energy storage of the cells typically gets released into the bloodstream, and it has to be put back into the cells again, which requires the release of insulin. So the effect of chronically elevated cortisol levels and stress can be diabetes, which is rather interesting. And the immune system, I'm not sure if you have noticed that, when it is on high alert all the time because you are so stressed, and then the stress suddenly falls away, will take a hit. So when you do your vacation or your holiday or whatever, after a long period of very stressful work, it's very common that you get sick as a result. And this is simply because your immune system was working on overdrive to suppress all the diseases that have been built up. But it won't really fix those diseases, which is also rather interesting. It will only suppress them, and they will surface after a while. And in that way, they can cause harm under the surface until the entire process comes to a halt, sometimes by force, simply because we fall greatly ill or something like that. And the next thing that comes to mind, and this is one of the major benefits for all the advanced practitioners, meditation leads to inner peace. So you are not stressed anymore. If you practice it rightly, you can literally be content with nothing. You sit in the middle of the room and are blissed out. Well, that's not the correct way of putting it, but you are completely contented. You are completely at peace. And this is a state that is unimaginably good. And it's also very hard to understand, because most of our striving is directed towards getting something. Like, we need food to feel content. We need sexual intercourse to feel content. We need drugs to feel content. We have to watch Netflix to feel content and feel good. And all this is optional. And you can realize that in meditation. And that is a huge moment of freedom when you are not shackled by all those external things anymore. You don't need them anymore to be happy. You can still do them and engage in them, at least in many cases, but they are not necessary anymore, so you are not shackled to them anymore. And the next thing that comes to mind when it comes to very worldly benefits is that meditation leads to a reduction in biases. To make progress in meditation and spirituality, which is very insight-based, very understanding-based, you have to be very self-honest. And you have to question your beliefs, otherwise you could not even start meditating. If you have the bias that meditation is something bad, that is only done by woo-woo people who don't really know what they're talking about or who are flinging tea bags at certain conventions, then you cannot get into meditation. So you also have to overcome some of your biases to even start meditating. And to progress at meditation, you have to undo a lot of your wrong understanding. And that can only lead to a weakening of the bias mechanism in your mind, simply because you do it a lot, which is also very important. And then the last benefit that I want to list here is that meditation reduces insomnia, depression, and anxiety. Many people quite literally dread going to bed nowadays. They distract themselves until they are basically falling unconscious. So they stay awake till 4 a.m. in the morning, watching series, playing video games, whatever. And as soon as they go to bed, their negative thoughts would typically surface. But they try to avoid that unconsciously most of the time, like the plague, because your mind will eat you alive if you neglect yourself for a very long time. And then there will be all kinds of super negative thoughts in your mind, and you simply cannot sleep anymore. So the only way out that most people know is that they try to fall unconscious, basically. So that's rather sad. And if you stop avoiding your problems via, for example, meditation, where you have to confront your mental states, then all those causes for depression, anxiety, and insomnia have to be uprooted. Because once there is a problem in your mind and you no longer ignore it or mask it or cover it up by sensual pleasures, then the mind will find a way to deal with it, if you approach it in a smart way, at least. So meditation really helps you remove the causes, the root causes, not the proximate causes or symptoms of your problems. And overall, in summary, meditation is the best practice I know for permanent increases in productivity. Meditation makes it quite literally effortless. And if you want more studies, as an example, you can also check out Richard Davidson and Daniel Goleman. Those have been recommended to me by a fellow meditator of long standing, so they are very likely very good. So you can check them out if you are into those study kinds of approaches to meditation. Again, I'm not a big fan of studies overall, but they can serve a purpose, at least in the very early stages, where you try to convince yourself of the benefits of meditation. And if we go into a deeper analysis, and I want to be fair, thus I do that, there are mixed results in terms of health. So you can meditate in a bad way. This is also possible, and that is something that people often do not portray rightly, in my opinion. Overall, stress and happiness are proven predictors for health or unhealth, if we want to call it like that, via the mechanisms of cortisol or serotonin. If we are very observant and look at studies and people who are, for example, addicted to opioids, like heroin, then we see that they do not get sick. They simply don't get sick no matter what conditions they are living at. They won't have a cold simply because there are very high levels of serotonin in the body. And that very much strengthens the immune system, which is pretty much proven. But as soon as there is a withdrawal, then they get sick immediately. It's rather interesting. And there are many case studies that you can watch on YouTube. There is a German YouTube channel which is called Schorestein Papier, who talks about his experiences with being addicted to heroin and getting off the entire process. And he talks a lot about all those symptoms, and it's very interesting. And yeah, the negative consequences of chronically elevated cortisol levels are all kinds of things like, well, Cushing syndrome, burnout, diabetes, depression, high cortisol in the blood, not much inner peace, etc. And meditation removes stress and unhappiness if you do it rightly. But overall, the effects on health cannot be really attributed to the meditation alone. So meditation alone only allows us to fix the ultimate causes of our problems. The simple motions of watching our breath are not responsible for all of this. So you have to keep in mind that there are ways of meditation that only make things worse simply because you do it in a wrong way. It's always important to keep that in mind. There are things that you can good and things that you can do bad. Anyway, let us continue. Now to the limitations of the studies that I already mentioned before. The modern world loves studies, and that is fine. I guess it is a better approach than having no basis for our judgment at all. However, studies do have clear limitations. They are always just a snapshot of our culture at a given time. So we have to be very careful. The same study usually cannot really be repeated, especially when we go into the field of psychology as an example, where we are strictly watching people's reactions and people's minds and preferences, etc. Then there is a recent, not really recent, I think it's 10 years old, discovery that a huge proportion of all studies cannot be reproduced. There is a reproduction crisis when it comes to studies. So we have to be very careful there. Sometimes there are numbers going as high as 95% of studies in certain areas cannot be reproduced. So those results are rather meaningless. And we have to keep that in mind. So when in doubt, it's always better to check all those meditation benefits for ourselves instead of relying on studies. Yes, we can use them as a door opener that allows us to practice, but we should not rely on them, because you can criticize the entire process rather rigorously. Because in essence, they are subject to bias and cherry picking. If a person wants to prove a certain point because they are convinced that that is true and everything else is wrong, and then they conduct a study, then it's very likely that their biases are flowing into the study, and the questions are designed in a way that they are framing the topic as an example. So when there is a person that is very convinced of the benefits of meditation, then they will very likely design a study in the way that it proves the benefits of meditation, and they will likely cherry pick, etc. And overall, there's also the problem of causation versus correlation. So if a person meditates and gets better, is this getting better due to the meditation, or the more meditation due to the getting better, as an example? Two things can happen at the same time without influencing each other, which is very important. And this is pretty much the definition of a correlation. Simply two things happening at once, or at the same time. And we are very fast as humans at jumping to the conclusion that one thing must cause the other. And we just go by those things causing the other things that we like most, because that is our judgment. The things that we deem agreeable or that cause us good feelings are usually the things that we deem right. This is simply one of the most fundamental biases as humans. And we have to learn to work against those things in meditation. And yeah, meditation studies simply try to objectify subjective experience. And this is not possible. So there's always some limitations, and they are often questionnaire based, and questionnaires are full of biases. So questionnaires are, well, you can use them to indicate if there is the need for future research. If you suspect that there are benefits, then you can do a questionnaire as an example and look and do a pilot study and see if there is need for more. And even meta studies are only as good as a foundation of research that flows into that. Simply because you put 800 studies into a meta-study, you analyze them and then come to a conclusion, that does not really mean anything. All those studies could be flawed. And it happened countless times in the past that people were following a research trend that was wrong. And there were countless studies on all of this. And in the end, it turned out, well, it's not so great after all. And the good examples that come to mind, at least from the IT world where I am working, are all the great buzzwords. There are buzzwords like big data and blockchain, and nowadays it's AI that can solve all our problems. And before that it was blockchain, and it was big data, and it was, I don't know, there was a new buzzword every year. And if you put those things to a close examination, you will find out that they are not as great as initially thought. And if you would have done a meta study on all those things, then you would have ended up with praises to the heaven, while they would not hold up to the test in reality. And only years later we have those results. So it's very good to be skeptical and really confirm the benefits that, for example, the Buddha suggests in your own experience. You can only really verify meditation claims for exactly yourself in your own experience. And that is very important to keep in mind. Yes, those things can be a door opener and they serve a good purpose for all that matters, but you have to keep in mind that there are limitations to it. They have good applications, they have bad applications, but keep in mind it's important to check for yourself. It's even unavoidable. Anyway, let us now come to the second section of this lecture, namely the section on karma, choice, action, or the law of cause and effect, as it is sometimes called, because you could phrase karma or kamma in that way. And it's very important, as one of the very big observations in science is also that our universe is based on cause and effect. So the cause and effect observation may as well date back to the Buddha himself, who might be the original source for basically most or all spiritual traditions that lead to awakening. Anyway, let us now begin. And I want to start with a very important citation from the Buddha, who would encourage his followers to frequently contemplate as follows, as you can see here in the box. And he said, "I am the owner of my actions, choices or karma," those words are more or less the same, "heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and have my actions as my arbitrator. Whatever I do, for good or for evil, to that I will fall heir." And this is a citation from the Anguttara Nikaya, the Book of Five, number 57. And I added to all those boxes of citations, from which we will encounter a lot, a QR code that you can scan. So you can actually see the citation for yourself. I wanted to make it very easy for you. Also, those boxes are color-coded. The blue boxes that we encounter will be citations, simple citations from the canon. The yellow or ochre boxes will be similes from the canon, and the green boxes will be experiments that should help you get an intuition and intuitive understanding on all the contents that I try to explain. And this statement that the Buddha gave here is rather drastic, and it promotes about 100% responsibility for everything we do. And this is very uncomfortable, but rather liberating for all those people who want to actually change their life for the better. Essentially what he says is that we choose all the time what we do. Our actions are essentially choices. When there is an inclination in our mind, as an example, then we do something. As long as we have the inclination to pick up an item in front of us, our hands will move towards it and pick up that item. That's simply how the mind works. And as soon as that inclination of mind is gone, then, well, the action stops. So we have to keep that in mind. So there is cause and effect at work there. So our actions right now shape our future. This is very important to keep in mind. And there are different meanings to the word karma, but intuitively we have to make sure that the word kamma and karma are words from two different languages. Kamma is a word for, well, action, choice, etc., from the language or the dialect that the Buddha spoke. And karma is the Sanskrit, the Indian language, the ancient Indian language, meaning of the same thing. So we have to work with two different translations and have to align those things. So it's very important to keep that in mind. I will try to use the kamma, the Pali words, as the Buddha likely spoke that, and it's often a good idea to do that, simply because it is closer to the original if you use the language. And the intuitive meaning that most people associate with the word karma is when something bad happens, it's karma. It was karma or whatever. And when the response comes really fast, it's instant karma. There are a lot of sayings around that. And in essence, the Buddha called it a universal law, like gravity. It's simply the law of cause and effect. Kamma means action, and action is an ongoing choice or inclination of mind, and humans are essentially a pile of choices, as the Buddha calls them. So whenever we make a choice, it influences our future, and then we make another choice based on that choice, and then we make additional choices based on that choice. And we will go through an example in the very near future to give you an understanding, a deeper understanding of how all of this works. And again, to make you understand that actions are choices, I want to make a small experiment or exercise with you. And this is pretty much the example of the first exercise block. Imagine picking up an item like a cup of coffee in front of you. How would you go about it? What must you do? And I would encourage you to stop at this moment before we go into the explanation part of this exercise and really think for yourself. How do you pick up an item? I mean, there are hundreds of muscle movements involved. So how do you go about it? Maybe stop and ponder for yourself for a while to get the maximum benefit out of it. After all, it is an understanding, and it's easy to cheat ourselves, and we should not do it. We should not self-cheat. It's a bit like having the solutions to an exam lying right next to us. Then we will likely look at them and won't learn anything. And that's something that many people sadly do. Anyway, let us now come to the solution. When you pick up a cup, you surely don't have to specify all the small muscle movements that are necessary to drink. Yet hundreds if not thousands of parts of your body have to act in unison to achieve the simple goal of picking something up. You simply choose to pick up the cup, and the rest just happens automatically as long as the inclination to pick that item up is upheld in the mind. The mind commands and the body does the job as best as it can. And all things follow pretty much this pattern. Our mind just chooses to ignore this simple fact, and it assumes control all the time. And it's very important to keep that in mind. It is an uphold inclination. Whenever we think about choices in the modern context, then we think about choices in the momentary term. We make a choice and then it's done. For example, if someone chooses to watch a Netflix series, then they make that choice once and then they act like nothing can be done anymore about it, and it just has to roll through pretty much. But that is not true. Choices or actions require an upheld inclination. We can only continue watching a Netflix series as long as we choose to do so. We can stop at any given moment, and it's important to keep that in mind. And now to another very important observation, namely that there are certain side effects of the actions that we do. One action does not lead to exactly one result. Action is ever present until we are enlightened. And actions last as long as a choice is present simultaneously. That is very important, the presence of the simultaneous presence of things. And that's a very key concept in Buddhism. There's not just one thing that we are attending to every time, all the time. There are a lot of things there at the same time. And this entire karma business is very important. Karma can, for example, bring fruits once an action is done. So then we say that it comes to fruition, as it's called in the Pali Canon. And karma, or certain actions to come to fruition, certain desires coming to fruition, often requires the right conditions or a certain setup. For example, to type something on your smartphone, you certainly have to be born at a time where there are smartphones. So there is a certain setup. Or if you want to eat some delicious food, you have to go out and seek out that delicious food. It won't fly to you. You have to make the conditions right in order for your karma, your actions to come to fruition. And based on that, we have to keep in mind that karma has lots of byproducts, or carryover as I call them, because we have to do so many other things that are necessary to fulfill certain inclinations or desires of ours. And suffering from side effects or past choices is a very real thing. For example, if we want a partner or want to, some mundane immoral goal, then we also have to live with the side effects of all of this. So when we want to have a partner, then we also have to live with the fact that that partner will likely die. Either we will die or our partner will die first, and we will go through a lot of loss and grief and suffering if we are very attached to that person. So that is just a very simple example that the Buddha often gave, that our desires and our things that we deem as very good also have a negative side that we should not lose sight of. And it can really help to think of choices as the ability to say no to things after they happened. Or once we do watch a Netflix series, we could at any point say no and stop watching it, as an example. And all those things are pretty much choices or actions. We could stop those things at any time. And carryover is a rather central paradigm that I really like on my channel and like to teach on my channel, because most people think that lifting will just make you stronger, as an example, or eating healthy will just make you healthy. But that is not true. In reality, all those things have tons of effects, and those follow the simple rules of cause and effect, which are very related to karma. And carryover is a property of complex and chaotic systems. So whenever we have a chaotic system, then the rules and associative relationships are very interconnected. So we can't really foresee the results that something will have. And small changes can have a very big effect over time. And most real systems are complex and chaotic. For example, the weather is very complex and very chaotic, and we can't really predict what the weather will be in 2 weeks. Most of the time we can't even predict the weather for 3 days or something like that. We only go by real broad trends. And the same is basically true for the climate as an example. We can't really predict it for any good amount of time into the future, which is something that many climate scientists always forget. Climate is based on weather, let's put it like that, over the period of 30 years or something. So we can't really predict it. The basis is a chaotic system, so climate is also chaotic. And there are even other examples where we would not expect it. For example, the planetary movement is also very chaotic and very complex. And we can't really predict where the moon, for example, will be in 1,000,000 years. Sure, the timescale is different, but the basic underlying problems are still there. But anyway, Carryover also describes the interconnectedness and the secondary benefits of problems or our choices. And we should always consider and sometimes optimize for that carryover, because it's essential for fast progress, and the order of all things do matter. And I think I have prepared a small illustration that we can see here. This is one of the maps that I like to use on my YouTube channel otherwise when I don't hold lectures. And this map basically shows the interconnectedness of all the very popular habits out there. There are colored entries that are very popular, something like instant gratification detoxes and lifting, nutrition, finances, or whatever you find here on the map. And there's also meditation. And right to the name of the habit, there is a certain number that I inserted there. And that is a carryover score that I have assigned to certain habits. For example, a carryover score of 1 indicates that one habit only really influences itself. And every carryover score that is higher indicates that other areas of your life will also be affected by a certain habit. For example, having good finances will also increase your efficiency at basically every other area of your life. You will have an easier time at weight loss, at dating, at your personal hygiene, at lifting, simply because you can afford better food, better gyms, etc. And the same is also true for all the other entries here on the map. If you lose weight and are not obese anymore, you will have an easier time lifting. You will have an easier time abstaining from instant gratification. Your endurance will be better. Your nutrition will be better. Your chances at dating will be better. Your finances will profit because you eat less. Your friends and family will have an easier time spending time with you because they don't suffer with you as much, and because obesity often leads to health problems. You can't go on hikes. Social events are not really an option for you, of a certain kind at least. So we really have to keep that in mind. There's a very huge interconnected mess that you could call related to cause and effect and related to your choices. If you, for example, decide to meditate, which is the one habit that I came up with, which has the biggest carryover score, then all the other areas of your life will also benefit, which is to a certain degree a motivational aspect that is only really covered in the next chapter. But still, meditation does make you calmer. It does make you indistractable. It gives you the ability to endure bad feelings. And all those things really carry over into all other areas of your life. So the simple choice of meditation makes a lot of merit. And you could call the good carryover merit to a certain degree, which is the word that the Buddha used. So when you make good choices in the past, then you kind of make a merit and can profit from that merit in the future. So your past choices, if they are good, are your merit. The positive carryover that you get from your choice to meditate, from your choice to live, will influence all the other areas of your life positively. Sadly, this is also true if you neglect any of those areas. So when you get obese, for example, then all the other areas that affect in this kind of presentation will suffer to a certain degree. And you have to keep that in mind and try to make intelligent choices and focus on those areas that matter most. And to illustrate the entire process of karma even more, I came up with an example from computer science. Not everyone here will understand it, but that's fine. I try to make it as simple as possible. In computer science, we have something that is called a functional programming language. And most programs that we write are step-by-step plans. We tell the computer exactly what he must do at any given time. So if you want to add some numbers, and we say load the first number from our RAM memory, then load the second number from our RAM memory, and then add those 2 numbers and write the result back into the memory. This is what we typically do with imperative programming languages. But with functional or certain functional programming languages, we do things differently. We do not specify a step-by-step plan to get to our result. We specify the result, and the computer or the compiler does the rest for us. And in a sense, this is how karma can be understood as an intuition. You can think about karma that way. It's like a request to the compiler, and the compiler is more or less like reality. You make choices based on your likes and desires, and the rest kind of just happens. So it's a good way of thinking about it, in my opinion, because it kind of works like that. You like certain things and you get those certain things. And most of the time we are in a situation where we get what we want the most, plus minus some side effects. This is always something that we have to keep in mind. And this is also something that Buddhist nun Ayya Khema frequently said. Most of us are at a point in life where we want to be, but there are also other effects that come as a byproduct, as negative carryover as an example. And the simple influence our choices can have, I want to illustrate in this diagram. This pretty much displays all the big choices I made in my life, plus an additional one that would influence all the others, that is in brackets at the bottom. So I, for example, 6.5 years or 7 years ago, decided that I wanted to have a partner. And now I have a partner or a girlfriend, pretty much. And that influenced every single other choice in my life, because my partner is obviously in my life and influences everything. So whenever I make a choice, I have to consider how it would affect my partner. Then I decided that I wanted to write a PhD thesis, that I want to be a doctor. And again, this required me to work at a certain university, for example, and learn and understand certain topics. Then I decided that I want to get into strength training, and that required me to get my health back on track, to do some weight loss because I kind of got obese over time. And then I wanted to focus on money, and all those things, as you can see, influence our future. So whenever you make a choice, you automatically influence everything else. It is completely interconnected. It's just the law of cause and effect. But in the past, we called it the laws of karma, pretty much. So when I decided to meditate, that also affected everything else, simply because I did not have as much time as before. I simply could not do all the things that I wanted to do before. I could not play as much video games as before, as I simply spent a lot of time in other areas, which is very important to keep in mind. And everything else is affected in the same way, and it's very important to keep that in mind in the same way. But anyway, let us continue. So maybe just one more remark. If I would have changed one of those entries, namely that I want a house at the very beginning, then all the other things would be different. For example, a PhD is not very well paid in most areas of the life. Well, it's a fine payment in Germany, but it could have influenced my decision to buy a house. And if I wanted a house really strong, then I might have had to search for another job, and everything else would have been different. So in a sense, we really are a pile of choices as humans, which is very important to keep in mind. But anyway, let us now continue. And now to the really important aspect, namely of past and future and rebirth, which is a very touchy topic for many people in circles that are not so much into Buddhism. We observed, for example, that the current desires and choices bring future results, like in the compiler example of the functional programming languages. We observe that everything we do now will bring future results, and everything we do now will influence our future in some way or another. But at some point, the future will be the past, and the same principles will still apply. And the logical assumption is that all things we experience right now depend on past choices, and that observation is very true. And this very much leads to the rebirth model of samsara that is very much propagated in Buddhism. And this really illustrates the pile of choices that we are as humans. No decision or word or even thought is without consequences. And only overcoming craving in itself, and craving is very important to understand, it's not just wanting certain things. Craving is wanting our situation to be different. Only terminating craving can terminate this entire process of karma that leads to a rebirth over and over again. You don't really have to believe in rebirth at first. It's a rather mythical element for many people, as they kind of misunderstand it. But once you start thinking about it in other terms and really try to explain it to yourself, then it gets a different touch. And then you can understand it better, and suddenly it makes more sense. Because most of the time it's just that the words other people from spiritual traditions use also have a meaning in our language that we speak. So there will be some misunderstanding between things other people say and the things that we say. So we have to keep that in mind. Many times it is not that other people are stupid, it's just that the words have different meanings. So once we come to terms with that, suddenly many people act rather logically. And that's a rather good approach, I find. Most of the time people are not evil, there's just a misunderstanding. They are also not dumb, it's a misunderstanding. Words have different meanings for different people, and we will also learn that in chapter 4 as an example, where I really try to formalize that process to make it easier for you to understand certain informations, and to really point to the fact that most of the time our understanding of what the Buddha said is just wrong, and not the Buddha is wrong. We simply apply our own meanings of certain words that we know to the words that the Buddha used. And that is very wrong in many cases, because the Buddha meant something entirely different in many cases. But anyway, let's now continue with Dhamma or nature, which is also a very important topic in Buddhism, and something that is also very scientific, because it pretty much presupposes knowledge about the process of abstraction and generalization that we use all the time in science, which is one of the key components. Famous intellectual and scientist Thomas Sowell even found out the ability to abstract and generalize as one of the key drivers of the success of entire nations, the ability of the people of a nation to abstract and generalize. And essentially, Dhamma means that what things stand on. And Dhamma with a small d means thing. And the Dhamma is a teaching of the nature of all things, as the Buddha presented it. And it is about finding most general and shared properties of all things, which is rather interesting. So what do all things have in common? This is something that we try to answer in Buddhism. And the thing about Dhamma is that it is preceding logic and reasoning in a way. And it's really necessary for logic to work. So the very general properties of all logical systems that are often implicit and overlooked are things that precede logic. For example, to do logic, we need a certain axiom system to be there. To perform logic on certain things, we have to have those things there available for us, which is rather interesting. And important to keep in mind. And thus you cannot really understand Dhamma by mere reasoning alone, because it concerns itself with things that precede the entire process of logic. So this is very important to keep in mind. And now we can do a small experiment to better understand it. Imagine that you have never seen leaves or trees before. And now a very important question: would you be able to recognize a leaf as a leaf? And now again, make a pause before we come to the explanation and try to reason to yourself. But the answer is obvious. It is impossible. The word leaf describes the essence, the nature of all possible leaves and the similarities they share. And in the same way, the Dhamma describes the nature of all possible things we can perceive. The Dhamma describes the characteristics all things have in common. And the Buddha described, for example, right attention as attention directed at the womb of experience. And this type of attention concerns itself with the understanding of the nature of things, and not just with the specifics, which is also one of the reasons why the sensation-watching meditations, where you try to catch all the details of your breath, are kind of wrong and not really in line with what the Buddha really taught. And that is also very important to keep in mind. But anyway, let us continue. Again, I like to illustrate the entire thing with a programming example, because programming is kind of very close to Dhamma practice in many ways, or we can use examples from programming to explain concepts of Buddhism. And now we can think of object-oriented programming languages. This is a rather fancy word, but what it really means is that a programming languages tries to model real-world objects by their properties. For example, we could call a car something that is made out of metal and has 4 wheels. Those would be 2 properties of a car. And that could be, well, reflected in an object in a mathematical structure, pretty much. And those objects in most languages can have an inheritance hierarchy. So cars and buses, for example, could be both vehicles. So now we have an object that has both, that generalizes both cars and buses. And then again, all vehicles could be man-made. So you won't encounter one of those vehicles in nature, as an example. And every man-made object consists of matter. And you can really generalize further and further until you find similarities between the properties of all things. Everything in a programming language, for example, has the type object. Everything is an object. That's why they are called object-oriented programming languages. And object is the nature of such programming languages. And another example would, for example, be the tree of life that you can find in biology, where you are also generalizing further and further until you find the common properties between all living beings, and traces them back to the common ancestor, as an example. So you generalize further and further until you have cells and bacteria, prokaryotes, eukaryotes, no idea. There are many ways that you can illustrate this process of further generalization. And if we do that with real objects, then we suddenly end up at a point where we are literally at the three characteristics that are of great importance in Buddhism. Namely, that things are there on their own for you to work with. They present themselves to you. Things are already there before we can do anything with them. And that, in that way, they are Dhamma precedes logic, which is very important. And now to some very important remarks about the nature of things, and namely what right attention is. And right attention, as the Buddha called it, could be called context awareness. He also called it womb attention, or yoniso manasikara. And the womb is pretty much what things are determined by. So to talk about things, they have to be there. So the there-ness of things determines all the things. So without the things being there, we could not talk about them. Without consciousness of things, we could not talk about them. So the consciousness would be the womb of our ability to talk about things, as an example. And the context is the overarching theme, or what is checked against. So what is more significant, for example, than our immediate sense objects, and the there-ness of things would be more significant, as an example. And now we could ask a question and let it endure in the mind. So to find out what, for example, the nature of things is. And the mind really tries to find relating informations to whatever questions we ask. So the mind is kind of working on its own. So we ask a question and then we do not allow it to jump to an immediate answer. And at some point there will be the answer to a question popping up in our mind. And the more general the context of something, the closer it is to the nature. The more we generalize and abstract, the closer we get to the nature. And mindfulness of death, or Maranasati, is not forgetting morality and not ignoring potential knowledges is, for example, what mindfulness really is about. And mindfulness is kind of always directed at the nature of things and not really at the particulars. So we try to keep something in mind that is closer to the womb of our experience and not to the particulars, which is also very important. But let us now continue with a small example when it comes to lifting weights, because that is typically easy to understand for most people. And the first thing that comes to mind, lifting weights, is obviously the motions that you do. There's bench pressing, there's deadlifting, there's squatting and whatnot. And those are kind of isolated. If you think about that as lifting, then that would be a very limited view. There are all kinds of things going on in the background. Namely that you have to have good technique with lifting, otherwise you would get hurt. Then your regeneration has to be good. Your nutrition has to be good. There are certain principles, overarching principles in the background, like linear overloading. Without that, you can't make any progress. That you need a caloric surplus, that you have to manage your stress and your cortisol levels. All those things are kind of background informations to lifting weights. They are not really in the lifting weights. They are not in the moving the iron parts or anything like that. It's context information. It's information that exists in relation to lifting weights, which is also very important to keep in mind. And you kind of can think about the background of experience or the womb of experience like that. Things, namely success in lifting, are determined by if you do overloading correct, if you are in a caloric surplus, if you manage your stress correctly. So that is one way of looking at that thing and getting an intuition of it. And now we come to mindfulness. And mindfulness is kind of, related to non-forgetting of attention that is directed at the nature of things. And the Buddha, and this is very important now, that's why I bring it up so early, explain mindfulness rather differently than people explain it nowadays. Nowadays, it's more of a sensation watching thing. We are mindful when we do not miss any part of our breath, is a typical assumption. But that is not what the Buddha said. The Buddha compared it quite vividly as we do it here. Imagine being a young mother with a single beloved child. She had difficulties getting pregnant, but it finally worked after a long time. Well, when she has to leave her newborn alone for the first time, there will not be a single second without thinking of her child. This is what true mindfulness is like. This is non-forgetfulness of her child in this case. And you can apply the same principle to many other areas. You can be non-forgetful of the breath, non-forgetful of your feelings, non-forgetful of the fact that you will die someday, non-forgetful of the fact that you have a body. There are many foundations of mindfulness, as the Buddha called them. And this is what proper mindfulness is like. The Buddha explained mindfulness as non-forgetting or recollection of things as already there. Mindfulness arises as a result of not being absorbed and not focusing on specific objects, which is a common misconception. It is about a broad context of experience, and true mindfulness is based on ignoring less than before and not about being just zoomed in on the breath. Mindfulness is always directed at the context of experience, at the womb of experience, pretty much, as I explained before, which is a rather fitting simile. But anyway, we are now at a point where I have talked about an hour, and I think that should be enough for today. As always, if you have questions thus far, I invite you to link them down below the video, and in the end, at the very last part of the lecture, I will create a video just answering your questions so that everyone can profit from it. So if you have questions, by all means, ask them below the video, and I will collect them and answer them in the future. But right now, we still have a lot of content to go. A small reminder, it's 777 slides in total. But anyway, I will thank you very much for your attention now, and I hope you enjoyed the content so far. Next time we will likely finish the lecture about the relationship between Buddhism and science and learn all the tools that we can use from science to make progress in meditation or in spirituality or liberation in general. But anyway, this is pretty much it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, hopefully. Goodbye.